How old is she now?
She is 87.
Talking about Romania and Bulgaria today. And so let's get going here.
Do you have a map again today?
I do.
Oh, good. I'm going to mute.
So we're moving south from Hungary, and as you come south, as I was telling Betty when we first got on here, the farther south you get, you find evidence of habitation from people in earlier times, as you get towards the Mediterranean and certainly towards Turkey. So they recently discovered, I think this was like in 1995, this cave, and it's Pestera Q Osea, or the Cave of Bones. And the interesting thing about the bones in here is that 6 to 9% of the DNA is Neanderthal people. And the other interesting thing about this cave is the predominant species of contributing bones in this cave were bears. So apparently this was a cave that bears used to hibernate in, but people also obviously used it. Hopefully the human bones weren't in there because bears drug them in there to eat them. So anyway, that just shows that people were in Romania 35,000 years ago. They've found old Stone Age tools that date back to the Paleolithic period. And then at the start of the Neolithic, the people that were in this area had come together in tribal groups, and so they were called the Dacians, and they controlled the area, which is basically modern Romania now. And the Dacians went a little bit farther south, and then there was another group down south of that was the Thracians. So by 10,000 BC, we find actually some artwork in some of the caves. They have some cave paintings that date back to 10,000 BC, and those are in Transylvania. By 4,000 BC, they were making distinctive pottery throughout Romania, and the way it was distinctive is the top of the pottery would have a decorative edge of some kind on it. So by 3000 BC, the Thracian people had migrated into this area from Asia, and we'll be talking more about them later on in today when we talk about Bulgaria. In 2000 BC, we have a distinctive Thracian subgroup that emerged in what's now Romania, and the Greeks called these people the Getae, and but to the Romans they were the Dacians, and Herodotus called them the fairest and most courageous of men, because, and I think this is really interesting, this is 2000 BC, these people believed in immortality, they believed in an afterlife. So this was certainly a little different than the culture of the Greeks and early Romans. 700 BC, the Greeks had arrived, and they were settling on the shore of the Black Sea for trading purposes. And they founded the towns of Istria, Thomas and Calatus, and so by the period of 70 to 44 BC, the Dacian kingdom came under the rule of a fellow by the name of Burebista, and he united several of the tribes of the Getae and the Dacians into a single kingdom, and he collected the income by raiding neighboring Roman communities that were outside of his domain of Romania. So he was raiding to the south and west, and he actually got caught up in the Roman Civil War in 49 to 45 BC, and he sided with Pompey, who opposed Julius Caesar. And the interesting thing of it is both Julius Caesar and Burebista were both murdered by, someone of their own followers in 44 BC, within about a month and a half of each other. So you have two really influential leaders died from murder from their own tribal followers, I guess you'd say.
Hey, Jim, excuse me. Do you have a screen share? I only see the people.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, I do.
Oh, good.
I think I forgot to put the screen share on.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Betty.
Uh-huh.
Okay, come on. Where's it at?
It's me.
I appreciate you speaking up.
Thank goodness, because I thought, oh my God, now I've gone from having
Yeah,
no microphone to now I'm not seeing anybody but the rest of us.
Okay, come on.
Now I
Okay.
can see it.
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
Okay, so the dominant group of people in the 4th century BC, outside of these Dacians in this area, were the Celts, and this is probably where the Celtic culture and whatnot kind of started at. And of course, then they moved and kept going west to try to keep from being conquered by other people, I guess. And so they started settling Transylvania, and there are archaeological remains of Celtic people that indicate that they were probably an elite warrior class. And the second oldest Celtic remains that are known anywhere in Europe have been found in Romania. So I thought that was kind of interesting. The one thing they said that I thought was kind of interesting is they buried people with their horses, but it was the horse hide and head, and they figured that they probably ate the horse as a funeral celebration meal. So there's not a lot of the bones that you would associate with the horse, because like the ribs and whatnot like that, I guess they would have gotten involved in eating that part of the horse. So I just thought that was kind of an interesting tidbit. 11% of the Celtic burial sites contain weapons, and these weapons were, when they found them, were almost always ceremonially bent. So they, if you had a sword, they'd bend the end over on it so it wouldn't be usable anymore as a sword. And the one thing that they noticed in doing archaeological examinations is the graves could seem to change towards later burials and indicate a mixture of Celtic and Thracian items in the graves. So So here's a map of the area we're talking about. So you can see the Black Sea, which is to the right, kind of towards the bottom. That's the Black Sea. So this area that we're basically talking about today, for a lot of its history, did have a access to the Black Sea through that shoreline, and then towards the north of the area was Hungary and Poland, and to the west were the Germanic kingdoms, and then of course to the south, we'll call it southeast of Romania, is Bulgaria, and then you have Macedonia and all the other Baltic states that are south of it. So that's kind of give you a picture. And this, again, this is a map of Dacia from about 50 BC. I skipped a page there. The next year's unifying king of the Dacians after Borbista was Decibel. His rule started in 87 AD, and Rome established the province of Moesia, which was south of this area, and it bordered on the Black Sea and Dacia. And anyway, King Durrus of Dacia overthrew the governor of Moesia, and he occupied much of that province. So Domitian, the ruler of Rome, decided that he wanted Moesia back, and he sent his military leader Cornelius Fuscus to take back Moesia, and he managed to drive the Dacians out of Moesia. And so the Domitian decided that since he was successful in driving them out of Moesia, that he'd go ahead and raid across the Danube, and he was going to try to get revenge for them taking it in the first place. So Fuscus led the Roman legion deep into Dacian territory, and they met Decibel's troops at a gorge on the Bistra River, and Decibel's army basically annihilated the Roman legion, and they killed this Cornelius Fuscus. Domitian appointed a new leader, Tedius Julianus, and he was an experienced soldier, and his task was to avenge Fuscus's death. So Julianus led his troops to the Dacian capital, and I can't pronounce this capital's Sarmas Getusia or something like that. And the capital was guarded by fortifications, as they call the settlement of Tepe, and the Dacians were defeated at Decibel, and the leader Decibel had escaped to the mountains, where he set up a army of wooden decoy soldiers dressed in battle gear. And this was successful in keeping the Romans from going any farther up into Romania after him. So Domination erected a memorial for all the dead soldiers that were lost in the first battle at this gorge. And apparently this particular monument survives to this date, other than the fact that apparently they had names carved in of the people who had lost their lives. And apparently you can't read any of the names on the columns anymore. Domination had more battles, so he finally made peace with Decibel, including that he pledged that he'd pay a tribute to him if he'd stay out of Moesia and the rest of the Roman Empire. So as with most of the early rulers of the Roman Empire, he passed on, and in 98, Trajan became the new ruler of Rome. And he didn't take kindly to paying tribute to anybody. So in 101, we have the first Dacian War, and Trajan marched several Roman legions deep into Dacia, and they had a number of battles that took place with Decibel's troops, and Decibel's troops were fairly successful in repulsing the Romans, but Trajan would always regroup and get more bodies. And so after regrouping in Moesia, Trajan's legions marched back to the Dacian capital, and this time they defeated the defenses at Tepe, and Decibel had actually worked with some Greeks that had knowledge of how to build siege engines and other weapons and whatnot, and Trajan was able to basically defeat all the fortification siege engines and whatnot, and he even was able to capture Decibel's sister. So at this point, Decibel admitted defeat, and he agreed to vacate the lands held by Trajan. So he went on up north on the edge of his property, and he continued to wage guerrilla warfare against Trajan's army. Decibel withdrew from the conquered territory, but he built up another army, and he annexed land to the north and west of the old capital. And this drew the ire of the Roman Senate when they found out what he was up to. And so the Senate ruled him an enemy of Rome. And that brought about the Second Dacian War, which was in 105. And Decibel's army had a successful attack against Roman territory, which they think was probably Banat. And Trajan was surprised by the fact that he was successful, and so he changed his tactic, and he launched a series of smaller raid on Dacian towns. And he did this really as a diversion to keep Decibel's troops busy while he built a substantial stone bridge to cross the Danube down in the area where Moesia was at. And when the bridge was completed, he marched several legions back up to the capital of Dacia. And this time, Decibel's troops were able to repel the legions, but Trajan's army shut off the water flow to the capital. And after a few days without being able to obtain any water, Decibel realized that there was no way out, that they were defeated. And he, at this point, he committed suicide rather than be taken prisoner. So at this point in time, Trajan incorporates Dacia into the Roman Empire. And during the next 165 years, Dacia would really become totally Romanized, including the language. Basically, the people in this area adopted the Latin language. So by 2000 or 271 AD, the Roman troops pulled out of Dacia. This is the period of time where they started to have to fight off all the so-called barbarians and all over the empire. So they didn't need to stay in Dacia for defensive purposes as much as in other parts of the Roman Empire. So by the 4th century, the Roman control was waning, and by the 7th century, Transylvania, again, this would be the northwest part of Romania, had totally lost contact with Rome. And as the Roman Empire collapsed, Romania reverted back to a more rural lifestyle. The towns that the Romans had built up and whatnot basically just kind of died back, and because there was, as the empire collapsed, there wasn't things to keep them as healthy towns and whatnot. So at the same time, a lot of people started migrating into this area from the east. So the Goths migrated into Romania in about 332, but they didn't stay long. Next came the Huns, and they occupied the area north of the Danube by about 420. And then the Gepids, they were a German tribe. They came into Transylvania in the late 400s. In 567, the Avars replaced the Gepids with their strong cognate, and they were kind of a multi-ethnic group. They were a mixture of Avars, Slavs, and Gepids, and they kind of took up their home in Transylvania. The 6th century, there was a large number of Slavic people came from the east into Romania. And then in the 7th century, the Turkic Bulgar people started their migration from the east, and they probably started in the area around the Ural Mountains or the Volga River, and they migrated south of the Danube, and they were also influenced by surrounding Slavic people. They kind of, the Bulgars and the Slavs kind of mixed together. So in 853 to 889, the Bulgar leader was Tsar Boris I, and he was the first ruler in this area between the top of Romania and the bottom of Bulgaria. He's the first one to accept Christianity, and he became an Orthodox Christian. And during his reign, Bulgaria had enough military power that they basically absorbed almost all of Romania, and the Avar cognate collapsed during this period of time, primarily because of pressure from Charlemagne's Frankish expansion. Of course, Charlemagne was in the west, and he was expanding to the east during this period of time. And interestingly enough, the Dacian Roman territory really converted to Christianity very slowly, and it was basically because of the Bulgar occupation of the 9th century. The conversion to Orthodox Christianity brought Old Slavic as the official language of the church. So several Old Slavic words were incorporated into the Romanian Latin-based language. The Bulgarian Empire really didn't last all that long. And with the death of Tsar Simeon in 927 AD, his successor was a very young, like 8-year-old child, and he made it to about 12, and he was poisoned, and that was at that point in time there really wasn't any strong central leadership of the Bulgars, and they fragmented. And about the same time, the Magyars entered the area in northern Romania. Of course, they're the ones that we talked about last week, settled Hungary, and they established a principality in Transylvania in the 10th century. And the principality was independent of Hungary until the 11th century. So Transylvania was its own self-ruling entity for about a century. Isvan Arpad, who we talked about last week, St. Stephen, annexed Transylvania to Hungary in 1002. So the settlers arrived in the 12th century in Transylvania, and they settled on both sides of the Carpathian Mountains. And the origin of the settlers was uncertain, but they're thought to be related to the Magyars because they basically kind of came together and settled in basically the same places as the Magyars. Other settlement groups of this era were Germanic, who came to the western part of Transylvania, and they came in the 12th and 13th century. The 13th century brought the formal division of Romania into 3 separate parts: Transylvania, Wallachia, and Moldova, or Moldava. Transylvania would develop with a western focus, while Wallachia and Moldova would have a eastern focus. Wallachia had to fight Hungary in 1330 at the Battle of Posada for their independence, and Prince Basarab led the defeat of the Hungarians in 1330. Hungary continued to press to annex parts of Wallachia because they were looking for access to more of the Danube and the Black Sea. They wanted to be able to, the Hungarians basically wanted to have their own Black Sea port, and so they were trying to annex Moldova. Prince Nikolai Alexandru, he claimed the title of dominant autocrat, as he really needed the authority to reinforce his rule. And he established the metropolitanate of Ungro-Galatia, and this was a dependency of the Patriarch of Constantinople. So this was basically setting up the Orthodox Church in Wallachia and Moldova. So at this point, with the church link, Wallachia decided that they needed their own state independence. Okay. Technical problems here. So I never had this happen before.
It's okay. You're doing a good job.
Okay. I think I'm back where I want to be now. So in the period of 1364 to 1367, we have Vladislav the First, and he established a new metropolitanate of Oltenia, and he resisted the incursion of the Roman Catholic Church into Wallachia. You know, a lot of what we see in these histories of, I'd say, the Middle Ages of these countries have to do with church-state conflicts, and so this is again an example of this, where you had both the Church of Constantinople and the Church of Rome trying to contest for people's attention and whatnot. So at this period of time, Vladislav recognized the sovereignty of the Hungarian King Louis the First, and in exchange for fiefdoms for little small areas of Figueres and Severin, which were located in Transylvania. So this, I think this was the very top part of Transylvania. Moldavia also resisted control of Hungary, and they continuously had problems with the Hungarians trying to take over Moldavia. So in 1359, Dragus led a revolt against the Hungarian rule, and then his successor Bogan led another revolt in 1364. Then Latsu of Moldavia, and he was the prince there from 1367 to 1374. He actually turned to the Church of Rome to help to try to get the Hungarians to keep trying to take over his country, because he figured the Hungarians were basically Roman Catholic, and maybe the Pope would get their leader to leave him alone. And so the Pope Urban V recognized Latsu as the voivode of Moldova, and so the Holy Roman Emperor Charles IV recognized Moldova as an independent duchy at this point in time. So we're in the period of time now where the Ottomans start to become a problem for this whole area. So in 1389, the Ottomans defeated the Serbian army at the Battle of Kosovo, and we'll hear a lot more about this next week. So in 1393, the Ottomans captured the Bulgarian capital of Tarnovo, and at this period of time, we have Wallachian Prince Mircea. He was Mircea the Elder, and he ruled from 1386 to 1418, and he defended the Wallachia from the Ottomans, and it was successful. His first action occurred when the Ottomans were taking Dobruja, and Sultan Bayezid invaded Wallachia while Mircea was actually absent, trying to take over Dobruja. The two rulers actually met at the Battle of Ravine, where Mircea won, preserving Wallachia's independence. Mircea came under continued Ottoman attacks, and he withdrew to Hungary. While in Hungary, the Ottomans put a pretender on the throne of Wallachia. So we had Vlad the usurper, and this Vlad actually enacted several pro-Ottoman policies, and so Vlad the usurper actually was able to defeat another Hungarian invasion to try to take over Wallachia. So Mircea returned to Wallachia in 1397, and he removed Vlad the usurper from the voivodeship. Mircea stopped two more Ottoman attacks, one in this is supposed to be 1397, one in 1400. The Sultan Bayezid, he died in captivity in Ankara in 1403, and the Ottoman Empire went into a 10-year power struggle over who should be the next Sultan. So in 1417, the Ottomans mounted another attack on Wallachia. And by this time, Mircea was quite elderly, and he was unable to mount a defense. So he sued for peace, agreeing to an annual tribute of 3,000 pieces of gold to the Ottomans, with the provision that Wallachia would not be made into a province of the Ottoman Empire. and as an example, he didn't want to end up having Wallachia be in the same position that Bulgaria and Serbia were in, which were actually made provinces of the Ottoman Empire. So after this, many years of relative peace followed. However, the sultans would continue to require Wallachia to not only supply their 3,000 pieces of gold a year, but also to supply troops and sons of the nobles or the boyars for military service. And of course, they took the sons of nobles and they took them to Constantinople, and they trained them. They sent them to school. They educated them, and they also trained them to be military officers. And this was a group that was known as the Janissary. And so at this point in 1420, 1430, Wallachia was basically a vassal state of the Ottoman Empire. Moldavia was, fortunately, they were a little, they were to the east, and they weren't in kind of a direct line of the Ottomans as the Ottomans were moving up trying to take over Hungary. So they had a little bit more time to enjoy their independence. And so they basically held the Ottomans off until the 16th century. So we got Stephen the Great of Moldavia defended Moldavia against Matthias Corvinus, who was the king of Hungary, and he was able to defeat him at the Battle of Baia. And that ended the Hungarians' attempts to gain control of Moldova. Stephen the Great also fought off the Ottomans at the Battle of Vaslui in 1475. But upon his deathbed, he advised his son to stay on good terms with the Ottomans. He realized that he'd literally spent his whole rule trying to fight off the Ottomans, and I think he realized at the end that it maybe wasn't really worth it to spend all your resources and effort to try to defeat the Ottomans. So in 1538, Sultan Suleiman I brought Moldova under Ottoman rule. So in the 16th century, the Ottomans clearly controlled Wallachia and Moldova, but they didn't incorporate them into the empire as fully governed provinces such as Bulgaria or Serbia. The Ottomans refrained from local governance. They allowed the boyars to continue to elect a prince, but the Ottoman Sultan maintained his right to approve the selection of the prince. So in essence, the Sultan actually was the one that selected the prince. And the Ottomans very specifically let the boyars know that they were not to engage in any kind of foreign policy, that was the rule of the Ottomans. And so the sultans were basically responsible for foreign policy in this area and for the defense of Wallachia and Moldova. By the end of the 16th century, the Sultan was actually the one that was selecting the prince, and the prince that was selected was expected to follow the Sultan's directions. So a few interesting facts here. In 1679, the first church liturgy was published in Romanian as opposed to Old Slavic. And in 1688, the Bible was published in the Romanian language. So we have three leading figures in this this era. The first one is Vlad Dracula. Now, this is Vlad Tepes, or Vlad the Impaler, and he ruled from 1428 to 1477 in Wallachia. And he actually had three different rules. He was captured and imprisoned for short periods of time, so and had his rule interrupted. At one point in time, the Ottomans invaded into Wallachia, and they got to the capital, Wallachia, to find, and this is what they claimed, that when they went into the capital, that there were 20,000 people impaled on stakes by Vlad. And so this is where he got the nickname Vlad the Impaler. The other interesting thing about Vlad the Impaler is he was kind of the model for Bram Stoker's Dracula. And Dracula, at the time that they had this title, was Romanian for dragon. And there was a group that was put together by one of the popes, which was a crusading group, and they used the dragon as their symbol. And supposedly this is where these Romanian people picked up the dragon. And later, Dracula became associated with the meaning of the devil. So that's a couple of interpretations of what Dracula actually means. The second person, and the other thing about Vlad is he was the grandson of Mircea the First, and so the second person is Stephen the Brave, and he was the ruler of Moldavia from 1593 to 1604. And then the last one is Michael the Brave, and he was the ruler of all three countries from 1593 to 1601. He basically tried to unite Transylvania, Wallachia, and Moldavia into a single kingdom, and he was able to do this for about a year. And then he was assassinated by one of his own generals who decided that he could lay claim to Transylvania by himself. So in the 1600s, the Habsburgs gained control of Transylvania, and then the Ottomans continued to control Wallachia and Moldavia. In 1699, Transylvania and Bukovina, which was a smaller part of Moldavia, were incorporated officially into the Habsburg Empire. In 1765, Transylvania was declared a Grand Principality of Transylvania, and it was further consolidated its special separate status within the Habsburg Empire. So in 1821, Moldavia lost its eastern territory east of the River Prut to Russia, and this was an area that was known as Bessarabia, and it was an area again that was fought over by people for a good long period of time. The Polish tried to gain control of this area at one point in time, and then of course the Russians came in 1821 and took it over. In 1856, Wallachia and Moldavia obtained independence from the failing Ottoman Empire. This wasn't total independence, but they were gaining independence. In 1859, Alexandru Ian Cuza is elected to the throne of Moldavia and Wallachia. In 1862, Wallachia and Moldavia officially unite as a nation state of Romania. So this is when 1862 is when Romania actually becomes a governing entity. In 1866, Carol I, he was a German-born noble, succeeded Alexandru Ian Cuza as the Prince of Romania. And 1867, Transylvania falls under the direct rule of Hungary. And there was a strong push to Magyarize everything in terms of names and official language and everything in Transylvania. In 1877, on May 9th, the Romanian parliament declared the independence of Romania from the Ottoman Empire. And a day later, the act was signed by Prince Carol I. So 1881, Kingdom of Romania was officially proclaimed. In 1892, the leaders of the Romanian of Transylvania sent a memorandum to the Austro-Hungarian Emperor Franz Joseph demanding the end of persecution and Magyarization attempts. The Transylvanians had pretty much had their fill with the Hungarians at this point in time. King Carol lived till 1914, and he passed away then, and he was succeeded by his nephew, King Ferdinand the First, and he would rule from 1914 to 1927. Romania entered World War I on the side of the Triple Entente. So they were, when they entered the war, they thought if they were tied up with France, England, and Russia, that they'd have a chance to reclaim Transylvania and also Bessarabia and Bukovina as parts of Romania. So in 1918, there were large public demonstrations in this area that were the people that lived in Transylvania, Bessarabia, and Bukovina declared they wanted to be part of Romania. In 1930, Carol II, Ferdinand's son, became the king of Romania, and he established basically a royal dictatorship at that point in time. In 1939, the Germans demanded a monopoly on Romanian exports. Interestingly enough, that during World War II, most of Germany's petroleum resources came from Romania. In exchange for this monopoly, Hitler agreed to respect the borders of Romania. So in 1940, the Soviet Union annexed Bessarabia and northern Bukovina. Germany and the Italian forces forced Romania to cede northern Transylvania to Hungary. We talked about that some last week when that was one of the things that came out of a conference in Vienna. And widespread demonstrations were held against King Carol. And Marshal Ian Antonescu forced King Carol to abdicate in favor of his 19-year-old son, Michael. And King Carol II fled Romania at that point in time. In 1941, Marshal Ian Antonescu imposed military dictatorship, and in order to try to reclaim Bessarabia, Romania entered World War II against the Soviet Union, which probably wasn't too good an idea. In 1944, King Michael engineered a royal coup and had Marshal Ian Ionescu arrested, and Romania at that point re-enters the war on the side of the Allies. I think we'll go ahead and take our break now. And so we'll be back in 10 minutes. Ukraine and those countries, because it's bounced around.
That also seems to be why Putin wants to bounce it back into his territory right now.
Well, yeah, some reason or other, he thinks it ought to be part of, you know, of Russia, and it really hasn't been part of Russia for very much of history. So we'll go ahead and get started back here. One thing I would like to point out that at least I observed is that we've got two countries here, Hungary and Romania, that during the Second World War tried to get themselves allied with the Allies towards the end of the war, because they realized that they were kind of on the losing side. So in 1945, the Yalta Agreement made Romania part of the Soviet system. It was, you know, this was part of Stalin's sphere of influence, and he considered anything that was that bordered on Russia was in his sphere of influence. So at that point in time, the communists basically took over and they dominated the government. So in 1947, Soviet troops were in Romania, and they imposed the Soviet influence on the Romanians. And they forced King Michael the First to abdicate in 1947, and they proclaimed a Romanian People's Republic. And King Michael left at that point and went to Switzerland. So in 1950, after Stalin's death, Romania starts to distance itself from Moscow. I think again they had the influence and view of what was happening south of them in Yugoslavia, where Tito was also trying to have a communist government, but not be closely aligned with Moscow. So in 1964, Romania declared autonomy within the communist bloc. In 1967, Nicolae Ceausescu became the president of the Council of State, and he merged the leadership of the state and party. And so in 1968, a year later, Romania condemns the Soviet Warsaw Pact for invading Czechoslovakia. And because they did this, Romania's communist leader, Ceausescu, earned praise, and he actually got some economic aid from the West. I think that's basically that's the way they put it in the book that I was reading about it. I think the aid came from the U.S. at that point in time. So in 1974, Romania was the first country to actually develop an official relationships with the European community. They actually signed a treaty that included Romania in a generalization system on preferences in 1974. In 1980, obsessed with repaying national debt and undertaking a megalomaniac building project, Ceausescu ordered a ban on the importation of any consumer products, and he commanded the exportation of goods produced in Romania, except for minimum food supplies. He wanted to sell everything that they could to bring money in, and he wanted to keep his own people from spending any money. So this really caused really severe restrictions on civil rights on the people in Romania. In 1982, the Romanians called on the Soviet Union to withdraw from Afghanistan. I think they didn't want to have anything to do with sending troops to Afghanistan or being involved with it. In 1987, Ceausescu indicates that Romania will not follow any of Gorbachev's reform efforts. And so at this point in time, Ceausescu was basically isolating himself from not only the Soviet Union, but everybody else. In 1989, the Romanians unite in protest against communist leadership, and they started having local demonstrations, and this results in the ouster of Ceausescu and his cabinet. So the next is my effort to provide kind of a little more of clarity to his ousting. So on March 10th of 1989, 6 members of the Communist Party sent a letter to Ceausescu, and they requested that he relax some of his demands to try to improve the standard of living for people. And these 6 Communist Party members wanted to improve some of the civil rights for people. The response by Ceausescu was the house arrest of these 6 party officials, and they were put under house arrest, and I guess until all this was over. On December 15th, a Hungarian Protestant minister was ordered by the government to transfer to a small village parish from his parish in Timisoara, and he refused to move, and the police went to arrest him. Several of his petitioners joined him in a protest to keep the police at bay, and then word got around, and many more people joined this protest, and soon the protest turned their wrath on Ceausescu and demanded his resignation. So this is December 15th. And at this point in time, the secret police got involved, and there were several people were killed that were taking part in the protest. So on December 18th, with obviously a lot of demonstrations and whatnot brewing and going on, Ceausescu decided that it was more important for him to go visit Iran for an official state visit, as and as I said here, he flew off to Iran as if nothing else was happening in his own country. On December 20th, he returned from Iran and ordered the military to quell the rioting in Timisoara by using any means available to him. At this point in time, the military refused to be involved in shooting any further civilians. On the 21st, the party loyalists organized a public demonstration in Belgrade, and their hope was that Ceausescu would calm down the demonstrators and remind them of how much Ceausescu loved and was devoted to his country people. Unfortunately, what happened is Ceausescu took the mic and he called out the Timisoara demonstrators as hooligans, and he claimed that they were being aided by foreign agents. And the crowd started booting and jeering him, and violence broke out, and the secretariat and the military fired on demonstrators, killing many more people. On the 22nd of December, the army had decided they were not going to fire on any more fellow Romanians. And Ceausescu decided he needed to have another speech to try to convince people the better times were coming. And he really was stubborn to recognize that the end was upon him. You have to keep in mind that certainly at this point, a lot of the other satellite countries had already renounced communism and had started the process of setting up their own independent free governments. So he organized another public address from party headquarters in Belgrade, and a large crowd gathered for this. And as he started to speak, the crowd called out lots of insults and started attacking some of his supporters. And the whole thing degenerated really rapidly, and Ceausescu and his wife were forced to flee to the top of the party headquarters building, where they had a helicopter waiting, and the helicopter flew them to north of Belgrade, where the army arrested them. On December 25th, they had a quick trial. This was a trial that was put on by the Communist Party officials, and they charged Ceausescu and his wife both with genocide, found them guilty, and they immediately executed them on the same day they had the trial. Ion Iliescu was kind of the leader of this whole effort, and he hoped to gain control of the government. And, so after the execution of Ceausescu, the Communist Party members decided really to seek a new direction, and they pretty much collectively decided they wanted to turn towards Europe, and so they renamed the party to the National Salvation Front, and actually held a free election in 1990, and the National Salvation Front won 85% of the vote. In 1995, Romania voiced its intent to join the EU, and they had to do an awfully lot to conform to EU's norms and requirements. In 1991, Romania adopted a new constitution, and in 2004, they joined NATO. And I think about 12 years after they expressed their desire to join the European Union, they they were admitted as full members of the EU. So now we're going to switch and talk a little bit about Bulgaria. Bulgaria is south of Romania, and it's east of Serbia and Macedonia, and it's north of Greece and Turkey, and it borders the Black Sea. The area of Bulgaria was based on archaeological evidence settled by humans at least 100,000 years ago. It definitely is probably the home of some of the earliest Europeans. By the 6th millennium BC, people were producing objects of originality and thought to be unique and not copied from other cultures. So this shows that the 6,000 years BC that the people had actually evolved enough to where they were starting to make some original artwork and whatnot. The culture by the 4th millennium had developed a reference for a mother goddess, and this is a little figurine right here that came out of an archaeological dig in Bulgaria of the mother goddess figure right here. The by the 3rd millennium of BC, the residents were producing non-food crops such as flax. So, and they were also producing all sorts of unique metalware. The 3rd millennium, the BC, the people that lived in this area were known as Thracians, and they are thought to have come again from literally from the east to occupy this area, and they were skilled silver and goldsmiths, and they were also noted horsemen. And they Thracians lived in a loosely formed tribal organizations. They were really kind of noted for not having any strong central leadership. By the 6th to 5th century BC, the Thracians were being threatened by the Persians, and at that point in time, they formed their own kingdom. And it was the Odyssean kingdom, and it basically united the Thracian tribes. In the 4th century BC, the Macedonian kingdom, which was again right to their west, challenged the Thracians, and the Thracians allowed basically the Macedonians to dominate them. And it's known that the Thracian archers and horsemen made up a substantial element of Alexander the Great's troops when he moved across and invaded the northern part of India. After the Macedonian pressure faded out, the Roman armies started their eastward movement in the 3rd century BC, and by the 1st century BC, Rome controlled the entire area. So this was the area that was basically developed into 2 states by the Roman Empire, Moesia and Thrace. So that was that had happened by 395 AD. The area where Bulgaria sits during the Roman occupation was crisscrossed by roads that went north and south and east and west. The intersection of one of the major roads was at Serdica, which is basically the site of modern day Sofia, Bulgaria. Of course, by the 4th century, Rome was in decline, and Mosia and Thrace were subjected to marauding tribal settlers. By the 7th century, the Slavs and the Proto-Bulgars, who came from the area of the Ural Mountains and the Volga River, were moving into the area and what is now known as Bulgaria. The Proto-Bulgars were a Turkic group, and as I'm going to show in a film about the Bulgars, they probably originally started in China, and of course, over the centuries, they migrated westward. The main difference that's pointed out is that between the Slavs and the Bulgars was that the Bulgars had a sense of political cohesion and organization, and they had a reputation for formidable military. In 680 AD, Khan Asparuch led his army across the Danube to establish the Bulgar community at Pilska, near what is now Shemin, and a Bulgarian state appeared at this time. So there was, by 680 AD, there was a Bulgarian empire in progress. So we're now going to watch a pretty well done history on Bulgaria. And what you're going to find in this is Bulgaria as a political entity has existed about 3 times with a really long gap of history in between where it was part of the Ottoman Empire.
The Bulgars are believed to be first mentioned in the 4th century as one of the 5 barbarian hordes in ancient China. The word Bulgar is generally considered to be of Turkic origin, meaning the mixed or the rebellious. As a nomadic horse-riding people subsisting primarily from raiding and pillaging, the Bulgars migrate west with a confederation of other Turkic tribes toward the riches of Europe. They are ruled by the Dulo clan and worship Tangra, the Turkic sky god. Their leader is Kubrat, who makes an alliance with the Byzantines against another Turkic tribe, the Avars. Then in
Oh, come on.
Then in 635 AD, unites the Turkic tribes, establishing the first Bulgarian state, called Old Great Bulgaria, and within 10 years defeat the Avars and grow in power. As Kubrat lay dying in 665 AD, he told his sons to fetch a bundle of sticks and to break the bundle in 2. When none of his sons could break it, Kubrat took the sticks and broke them one by one with his feeble hands. The sons understood the father's message. Their strength depended on their unity. Soon after Kubrat's death, another Turkic tribe, the Khazars, make a fierce attack on the Bulgars, destroying Old Great Bulgaria, and the sons go their separate ways. One son, Kotrog, going north, founding Volga, Bulgaria, and another son, Asparuk, goes south to the Danube, establishing the first Bulgarian Empire. Khan Asparuk, listening to the words of his father, keeps the Bulgars united and mightily rules the empire, conquering the Slavic Balkan tribes and quickly expanding his domain. He built the capital Pliska, from where Bulgaria would continue to conquer the Balkans and launch attacks on the Byzantines. After Oscar, Tervel becomes the Khan of Bulgaria. Tervel is a close Byzantine ally after aiding Justinian II to return to the throne. For this, Tervel is given many gifts, including the title Caesar, making him the first foreign ruler to carry this title in Byzantine and Roman history. In 717, Constantinople is sieged by Arab forces, and the Byzantines call on Tervel, arriving with a Bulgarian army and routs the Arabs. This event makes Tervel a revered figure in Orthodox Christianity, even though he himself was a pagan. After many years of internal strife amongst the Khans, in 796 Khan Krum takes over. Krum makes strict order in the empire and has a policy of territorial expansion. Around 805, Krum attacks and defeats the crumbling Avar Khaganate, conquering the Pannonian Basin and the Carpathian Mountains. Krum then embarks on a military campaign against the Byzantine Empire, defeating the Byzantines in Struma and Serditsa. The Byzantine Emperor Nicephorus starts a large counteroffensive, invading deep into Bulgaria, ignoring Krum's calls for negotiations and sacking the capital Pliska. Krum intercepts Nicephorus, returning to Constantinople, trapping his army in the Varvitsa Pass, wiping them out, and killing Emperor Nicephorus. It is said Krum had the emperor's skull lined with silver and used it as a drinking cup. Krum continues on his warpath and invades Thrace in 813, capturing many Byzantine cities. Krum advances on Constantinople, hoping to take the city and get his vengeance on the Byzantines. The new emperor, Leo the Armenian, calls on a meeting for peace, where Krum is ambushed and injured, making his escape. Furious, Krum ravages the outskirts of Constantinople, returning home to prepare a major attack on the city. However, on April 13th, 814, Krum dies, being succeeded by his son Omertag. Omertag begins his rule by making peace with the Byzantines, signing a 30-year peace treaty. During the peace, Omertag defeats rebellious Slavic tribes in the empire, integrating the Bulgar and Slavic peoples closer. Omertag is called the Builder for reconstructing the damaged capital Pliska, including a new palace and temple to Tongura. He begins a persecution of the Christian population, viewing it as subversive to the state, and further strengthens the empire. In 836, Presian, the grandson of Omertag, takes over and begins expansion south, conquering Slavic tribes in the region of Macedonia. In the conquest, Presian invades Serbian territory, starting a war with the Serbs. For 3 years, Presian fights the Serbian tribes, and he is defeated, being driven out by the Serb chieftain Vlastimir. This crushing defeat ends Presian's expansion, and he dies 10 years later, being succeeded by his son, Boris. Boris, seeking vengeance for his father's defeat at the hands of the Serbs, in 853 sends an army commanded by his son Vladimir to the Serb lands, where they are defeated again, and Vladimir is captured, along with 12 Bulgarian noblemen. Boris negotiates the return of his son and makes peace with the Serbs. Bordered on one side by Moravia and on the other by the Byzantines, the Bulgars were surrounded by Christians and under constant threat. While internal strife begins to rise after repeated losses to the Serbs, Boris decides in 864 to convert Bulgaria to Christianity. In a secret baptism, Boris, together with his family and a select few of the Bulgar nobility, are baptized by Byzantine clergymen making peace between both empires. After consolidating political power, Boris declares Christianity the state religion, and that summer a group of Bulgar nobles stage a revolt in defense of the Turkic Bulgar faith. Boris ruthlessly suppresses the revolt, executing the nobles along with their families, quieting any opposition to the Christianization of Bulgaria. Boris then seeks an independent Bulgarian church. After rejection by the Patriarch to be granted independence, Boris turns to the papacy, which ignites a conflict between the papacy and the Byzantines. In order to prevent the creation of a papal state at Constantinople's doorstep, the Byzantine Patriarch finally grants Bulgaria the status of an independent church in 870. Boris begins to build up the Bulgarian clergy, and in 886 invites two disciples of Cyril and Methodius, Clement and Naum, to come to Bulgaria and develop the Bulgarian clergy and schools. The two disciples establish educational centers throughout Bulgaria, training Bulgarian priests and developing a new alphabet called Cyrillic, which is made the official alphabet of Bulgaria. Due to the Slavs having become the majority population, the Slavic language is declared official in 893, replacing the traditional Turkic Bulgar language of the upper class. This declaration sparks an uprising by Boris's son, Vladimir, who with a militia of Bulgars attacks the Christian temples in an effort to preserve the Bulgar language and pagan religion. Boris defeats Vladimir and has his eyes gouged out, relinquishing the throne and becoming a monk to live his life in peace and solitude. The establishment of an independent church, one official language and writing system, firmly unites a state of two very separate peoples into a homogeneous society. Boris's third son, Simeon, begins his rule of Bulgaria in 893 and is immediately faced with attacks from the invading Hungarians in the north. Simeon makes an alliance with the Turkic Pechenegs and together launches an attack on the Hungarians, sending them into retreat. Simeon then turns his attention south, invading Byzantium, annihilating Byzantine forces in the Battle of Bulgaria-Figon, and conquering all of the Slavic inhabited northern Greece and a bulk of the Serbian territories, vastly enlarging the empire. During Simeon's reign, Bulgaria reaches its cultural peak, becoming the literary and spiritual center of the Slavs, with the Cyrillic alphabet spreading from Bulgaria to all the other Slavic states, most notably Kievan Rus, which would later become Russia. After Simeon's death in 927, a series of rebellions occur between his sons for the succession of the throne. Taking advantage of the weak internal state, in 933 the Serbian prince Chaslav starts an uprising with Byzantine support, resulting in Bulgaria losing territories in the Western Balkans. Allying with Kievan Rus, the Byzantines defeat the Bulgarians in 971, resulting in the Bulgarian loss of Thrace and Lower Moesia. In 997, Tsar Samuel comes into power and as a skillful general launches many successful attacks on the Serbs and the Byzantines. Samuel annexes the Serbian Principality of Duklia and imprisons the Serb leader Jovan Vladimir, making the new capital of Bulgaria Ohrid. The Byzantine Emperor Basil II, with a vow to destroy the Bulgarians, amasses a large army to completely conquer and destroy Bulgaria. In 1001 AD, Basil begins his campaign, and in the next 3 years captures the old Bulgar capital Pliska, expelling the Bulgarians from Thrace and Macedonia. At the same time, the Hungarians attack in the north, annexing Bulgarian lands in the North Danube. Basil continues on his rampage for the next 10 years, defeating Samuel and the Bulgarians in beating Skopje and Dyrrhachium on the Albanian coast. In 1014, after another Bulgarian defeat, 15,000 Bulgarian soldiers are captured, and Basil orders them all to be blinded, with one of every 100 men to be left with one eye to lead the rest home to tell the tale. This ruthlessness earns Basil the nickname, the Bulgar Slayer. When the blinded soldiers arrived home, Tsar Samuel was so shocked that he received a heart attack, dying 2 weeks later. Basil finally conquers all of Bulgaria 4 years later in 1018, incorporating it into the Byzantine Empire and ending the First Bulgarian Empire.
A former Goldman Sachs PhD says, "We are never returning to normal. A strange phenomenon is distorting America."
For nearly 200 years, Bulgaria was a province of the Byzantine Empire until Asen, a wealthy shepherd of either Vlach or Turkic origins, begins a rebellion with his brothers against the Byzantines in 1185. Gathering a vast army of Bulgarians and Vlachs, Asen also forms an alliance with the Cumans, a Turkic people living north of the Danube River. They begin attacks, defeating the Byzantines, and carve out territory along both sides of the Danube, making the capital Tarnovo and declaring restoration of the Bulgarian Empire. Asen's younger brother, Kaloyan, takes over in 1196, and in revenge for the blinding of Tsar Samuel's soldiers, takes the name Romanov-Tonos, the Byzantine Slayer. In negotiations with Rome, Kaloyan receives recognition as an emperor, and the Bulgarian church is elevated to a patriarchate in spite of Byzantine opposition. Asen's son, Ivan Asen II, becomes emperor in 1218 and continues Kaloyan's anti-Byzantine policies, attacking Byzantine forts in Macedonia and Epirus, conquering the territory and expanding the Second Bulgarian Empire to its territorial peak. He's succeeded by his infant son Kaliman, which greatly weakens the empire, and is forced to pay tribute to the expanding Mongol Empire in the north. The 12-year-old Kaliman is poisoned, and rivalries begin to ensue amongst the nobility, causing a rapid decline of the empire. The constant raids, political instability, and economic problems lead to a popular uprising in 1277, when a rebel army led by swineherder Ivailo defeat the Mongols and turn on the Bulgarian army, killing Emperor Constantine T. The Byzantines support the Asen dynasty and provide 10,000 troops to defeat Ivailo, who for 3 years holds them off until he's killed by the Mongols. The Bulgarian nobility elect George Terter, a noble of Cuman descent, to be emperor, starting the Terter dynasty. George rules for 12 years, making strong alliances with the Mongol Empire, eventually becoming a vassal of the Mongols in order to protect from Byzantine attacks. The Kingdom of Serbia begins expanding into Macedonia, and Michael Shishman, the new emperor of Bulgaria, makes an alliance with the Byzantine Empire for a joint offensive against Serbia. In 1330, Shishman invades Serbia with 1,000 troops and battles the Serbs, getting utterly defeated, and Emperor Shishman getting beheaded on the battlefield as his troops retreat. This battle was a disaster for Bulgaria, and Bulgaria becomes a vassal of the elevated Serbian Empire under Tsar Dusan. In 1371, after a defeat by the invading Ottomans, the Serbs withdraw from Bulgaria. Helpless, Bulgaria becomes a vassal of the Turks, and within 20 years completely conquered, putting an end to the medieval Bulgarian state. Under the Ottomans, for 500 years, the Bulgarians acquired Turkish words, Turkish food, and a significant ethnic Turkish population. As the Ottoman Empire weakens in the late 19th century, the Bulgarians, inspired by the earlier Serbian and Greek uprisings, stage an uprising in 876, resulting in the establishment of an independent Bulgarian state 2 years later. The new Bulgarian state is much smaller than what they were promised by the great powers in the Treaty of San Stefano. In 1908, with the further collapse of the Ottoman Empire, Bulgaria is enlarged, receiving Thrace and portions of the Black Sea coast, but many Bulgarians are unhappy with Macedonia still being in the Ottoman Empire. The Slavic populace in the Macedonia region, being of mixed Serbian and Bulgarian origins, Most Bulgarians consider them to be Bulgarians, and Macedonia region to belong to the Bulgarian state, as it was the location of the old capital in the First Bulgarian Empire. In 1903, a militant Bulgarian liberation movement called the Internal Macedonian Revolutionary Organization, or VMRO, starts the Ilinden uprising in the Ottoman Macedonia. The uprising is ultimately a failure, and its leaders are arrested or executed within months, but it sparks a bloody Macedonian civil war amongst guerrilla factions based on ethnic lines. The Bulgarian Komiti, the Serb Chetniks, Greek insurgents, and Ottoman soldiers, all trying to carve out their own piece of the Macedonia region. The Civil War continues, igniting the Balkan Wars of 1912 to 1913, where Bulgaria allies with Greece and Serbia, and they together defeat the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria conquers back large parts of Thrace. However, on the 29th of June, 1913, Bulgaria turns on its allies and attacks Serbia and Greece with the aim of taking all of Macedonia. Bulgaria suffers many defeats and are even invaded by Romania and the Ottomans. The Bulgarians call for peace, and in the Treaty of Bucharest, the Bulgarians settle in the current borders of Bulgaria, but with much bitterness. In 1914, the First World War erupts, and the Bulgarian Tsar Ferdinand, seeking vengeance for their defeat, allies with the Central Powers, Austro-Hungary, Germany, and the Ottomans, to fight Serbia and Greece and take Macedonia. In 1915, Bulgaria makes its attack on Serbia, occupying much of southern Serbia, including Niš, and invades Greek Macedonia and Romanian Dobruja. In 1918, however, the Serbs, British, French, Italians, and Greeks break through the Salonika front, overwhelming the Bulgarians, leading to mass desertions and surrender. Following defeat, Tsar Ferdinand steps down and goes into exile. In 1919, Bulgaria is proclaimed a republic. In 1941, World War II starts, and faced with an invasion while still longing for Macedonia, Bulgaria enters into an alliance with Hitler and the Nazis. With Yugoslavia and Greece defeated, Bulgaria occupies all of Greek Thrace and Macedonia. But when the Nazis begin losing in 1944, there's a communist uprising in Bulgaria, and the Soviets enter and arrest the regime for war crimes, executing them all. Bulgaria is communist for 45 years, allied closely to the Soviet Union, up until its fall in 1991, when Bulgaria becomes a democracy. 13 years later, joining NATO and then the European Union. If you enjoyed this video, please click below and support this channel with a donation on our Patreon page.
Well, I think hopefully you got a picture of Bulgaria as being a country that's had a very stormy and difficult past.
Welcome to the first Holocaust Living History workshop of the new academic year. I'm Suzanne Hillman, the program coordinator. I would just like to draw your attention to our next event before saying a few words about the theme of this year's lecture. On November 2nd,
I wanted to ask, I thought Bulgaria was a communist country. Is that not the case now?
No, it's a excuse me. It's a democratic country now. I think it's another one of these countries that the communists, because when all of the communist countries fell apart, the only people that really had any experience in running government were the party people. So it made a kind of a slow transition into a democratic state.
That's interesting.
Who's the leader, Jim?
Huh?
Who's their leader?
I don't know who their president or prime minister is right now.
Okay.
I just thought kind of the interesting thing is that you had really two Bulgarian empires, and the one was huge. I mean, it went all the way up to Hungary. So, at that period of time, they dominated pretty much the southern half of Eastern Europe.
And which countries made up the Byzantine Empire at this time?
Well, it always stayed that area that's, where Turkey is today, along the Black Sea. And, the Byzantine Empire, if you trace its history, it became huge at one point in time and then shrank back to a very small thing. I remember when I took Ernie's class on the Byzantine Empire, that the one thing that impressed me is when it actually fell to the Ottomans, it was Constantinople was down to about a population of about 750 people, because everybody fled at that point in time, and I think it was like 1432. So we're moving on to our last session, and next week we'll deal with the Balkan countries, and of course there are quite a few of them. And as I think you saw in this presentation on Bulgaria, they were fighting over Macedonia, and the people in this area fought over this little chunk of rock basically for forever, and everybody thinks it ought to be part of their country. So that's pretty much all I got for today. I appreciate your attention, and
you're not talking about the Baltics next time. It's I think you misspoke. Balkan.
The Balkans.
Sounded to me like you said Baltic, maybe by mistake.
Balkan. BALKAN.
That's what used to be Yugoslavia to a great extent of it, anyway.
That's correct.
Well, the capital of Serbia is Belgrade, and the capital of Romania is Bucharest. And you had Belgrade for Bucharest. So
okay, thank you.
That's all right. It's easy to
appreciate that.
That's all right.
I even thought about that last night when I was looking through my presentation. I kept thinking, I picked the wrong B.
Yes. It's interesting how different countries look their history.
Yeah.
And if you compare one against the other, the Byzantines consider the Bulgars awful nuisance. They were, so as they talk about the Bulgar Slayer, the Emperor Bulgar Slayer, I'm having a senior moment anyway, and that's how is the dimension that he captured 15,000 soldiers and blinded 99 out of 100 in both eyes. Just I mean, some historians really question, is that really true? But the Byzantines consider that a very important event in their history.
Yeah.
So, well, thank you, Jim.
Yeah.
Thank
Well,
you. Thank
I
you.
hope everybody has a great weekend, and we'll see you next Friday.
You too, Jim. Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Same to you.
Thank you.